My sister watched me collapse on the lawyer's floor and whispered, "Stop pretending, Melissa. You're embarrassing yourself." I wasn't pretending. I was dying. 3 days earlier, Rachel had swapped my blood thinners with colon cleanse pills, identical little capsules that I trusted without question. Her theory I'd been faking my heart condition for years to get attention. "Let's see how sick you really are without your precious pills," she'd smirked when she thought I wasn't listening. By the morning of Grandpa's will reading, my heart was racing so hard I could hear it pounding in my ears. My fingers tingled. My vision blurred at the edges. When I finally crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, Rachel didn't call 911. She stood over me with her arms crossed. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandpa had been watching. He'd seen things, documented things. And the lawyer was about to open a file that would turn Rachel's smug smile into something I'd never seen on her face before: pure terror. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you? My name is Melissa Gray. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a senior financial analyst at a firm downtown, a job I earned through years of late nights and relentless dedication. But to my family, I've always been the invisible one, the daughter who somehow never quite measured up to my younger sister Rachel. I pulled into my parents' driveway the evening before Grandpa William's will reading, already feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Rachel's white BMW was parked in my usual spot, of course. She'd been here for 3 days already, helping Mom prepare for the gathering after tomorrow's reading. No one had thought to invite me early. No one ever did. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel how thoroughly Rachel had already claimed the space. Her designer luggage sat in the best guest room. Her voice floated from the kitchen, laughing at something Dad said. Fresh flowers, her arrangement, I'd later learn, sat on the dining table like a centerpiece announcing her presence. "Melissa, you made it," Mom said, barely looking up from the salad she was tossing. "Rachel's been such a help. She even coordinated with the caterers." "I got promoted last month," I offered, setting down my bag. "Senior analyst now." Mom nodded absently. "That's nice, dear. Rachel, tell Melissa about the lovely flowers you picked for tomorrow's lunch." I swallowed the familiar sting and said nothing. What struck me as odd, though, was Rachel herself. She was being unusually attentive, not to our parents, but to me. She brought me water without being asked. She noticed when I took my evening medication and commented, "You still take those pills twice a day, right, morning and evening?" That must be so exhausting. Rachel had never shown the slightest interest in my health before. She'd always dismissed my heart condition as Melissa being dramatic, rolling her eyes whenever I mentioned doctor's appointments. But now she watched me swallow my blood thinners with an intensity that felt strange. I told myself it was grief. Grandpa's death had affected us all differently. But my analyst instincts kept noticing other things. Rachel's handbag was last season's unusual. For someone who refreshed her wardrobe religiously, her manicure was chipped, her nails bitten short underneath. She checked her phone constantly, stepping outside to take calls in hushed, urgent tones. At dinner, when Rachel tried to pay for the wine she'd ordered, her credit card was declined. She laughed it off, blaming a fraud alert, but I saw her hands tremble as she slid the card back into her wallet. The real tension came when the phone rang during dessert. Rachel answered, and I watched her face flicker. Fear quickly masked as she listened. That was Mr. Morrison, Grandpa's lawyer. She announced, her voice a touch too bright. "He said Grandpa left specific instructions. The reading will be recorded, and there's some sealed document that can only be opened under certain conditions." She laughed. Grandpa and his dramatics, right? But she excused herself immediately after, and from the hallway, I heard her making another call, her voice low and sharp. That night I couldn't sleep. My heart fluttered strangely, more irregularly than usual. I'd felt increasingly tired over the past few days, dizzy at odd moments. I blamed grief and stress, and went downstairs for water. That's when I heard Rachel's voice from the dark kitchen. "I told you I'll have the money after tomorrow. The reading is in the morning. No, there won't be any complications. I've already taken care of it." I must have made a sound because she spun around. For one unguarded moment, her eyes met mine, and what I saw there wasn't sisterly concern. It was calculation. "Couldn't sleep." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look pale, Melissa. Are you feeling okay?" You should really rest. Tomorrow's a big day. Her concern sounded rehearsed, and standing there in the dark kitchen, my heart beating its strange, unsteady rhythm, I realized something that made my blood run cold. My sister looked almost expectant, like she was waiting for something to happen. I barely slept that night, and by morning, I felt worse than I had in years. My heart pounded against my ribs in an uneven rhythm that made me catch my breath. When I looked in the mirror, my face was pale, almost gray, and my fingers tingled with a strange numbness I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nerves. Grandpa's will reading was today. Of course I was stressed. The drive to Attorney Morrison's office felt longer than it should have. I sat in the back seat of my parents' car while Rachel rode up front, chatting easily about the weather, the traffic, anything except the grandfather we were about to say a final goodbye to. I pressed my hand against my chest, willing my heart to slow down. It didn't listen. The law office was cool and quiet, decorated in dark wood and leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car. I lowered myself into a seat at the conference table, gripping the armrest, as another wave of dizziness washed over me. The air conditioning hummed softly, but I was sweating through my blouse. My vision blurred at the edges, then cleared, then blurred again. I reached into my purse for my medication. I'd been taking it faithfully twice a day, just like always, but the symptoms kept getting worse instead of better. As I shook a pill into my palm, something nagged at me. The pill looked right. Same size, same color, same shape. But I'd felt progressively worse since arriving at my parents' house 3 days ago. That wasn't normal. That wasn't how my medication worked. Years of training as a financial analyst had taught me to notice patterns that didn't fit. When numbers didn't add up, there was always a reason. When trends moved in unexpected directions, something was driving them. My body was telling me something was wrong, and I'd spent 3 days ignoring it. I made a decision. Discreetly under the table, I pulled out my phone and photographed the pills in my bottle. Then I opened my text thread with Dana, my friend from college, who worked as an ER nurse at Memorial Hospital. I typed quickly, "Hey, weird question. I've felt off all week, heart racing, dizzy, fatigued. Does this look like my usual metoprolol something feels wrong?" I attached the photo and hit send before I could second guess myself. Dana worked night shifts. She might not respond for hours. But I'd learned a long time ago to document anomalies, even when I wasn't sure what they meant. If something was wrong, I wanted a record. I swallowed the pill anyway. What choice did I have? I needed my medication, and this was all I had. It didn't help. Of course it didn't help. I know that now. Attorney Morrison entered the room, a thick folder tucked under his arm. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like someone's favorite professor. He greeted each of us by name, his expression appropriately somber. "Before we begin," he said, settling into his chair, "I want to remind everyone that Mr. Gray left very specific instructions for this reading. Per his request, the proceedings will be recorded." He gestured to a small camera mounted in the corner of the room. He also left a sealed document to be opened, only under certain conditions, which I'll explain as we proceed. I tried to focus on his words, but the room was starting to tilt. My heart raced, then seemed to skip several beats in a row. The numbness in my left arm intensified, creeping up toward my shoulder. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "Ms. Gray." Attorney Morrison was looking at me with concern. "Are you all right? You look quite pale. Should we postpone the reading?" Before I could answer, Rachel's voice cut in smooth and reassuring. "My sister has anxiety. She's always been sensitive to stress. This happened at Dad's birthday too, remember, Mom?" My mother sighed, the sound heavy with years of practiced disappointment. "Melissa, please, not today. This is about honoring Grandpa's wishes. Can you hold yourself together for 1 hour?" My father didn't even look at me. "Maybe step outside for some air. Rachel can fill you in on anything you miss." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell them something was genuinely wrong, but the words wouldn't come. The room was spinning now, and their voices seemed to come from very far away. No one was listening. No one ever listened. I was invisible, even when I was dying right in front of them. Attorney Morrison looked unconvinced by my family's reassurances, but he continued anyway. He opened Grandpa's file, and I saw a thick stack of documents, a sealed envelope clipped to the top. "William Gray's last will and testament," he began, "dated and notarized 6 months prior to his death." That's when the crushing pressure hit my chest. It felt like someone had placed a boulder on my sternum and was slowly pressing down. My vision narrowed to a pinpoint, the edges going dark. I tried to stand, tried to call for help, but all that came out was a gasp. Then my legs gave way, and I was falling crashing to the floor, the impact jarring through my shoulder and hip. 3 days. 3 days without my real medication. My heart, already damaged, had finally given out. I heard voices above me, distorted and distant. Through the narrowing tunnel of my vision, I saw Rachel spring to her feet, phone in hand. "I'm calling 911. Her voice was urgent, concerned, the voice of a loving sister in crisis. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, we need an ambulance at Morrison Law Office, 4521 Oak Street. My sister collapsed. I think it's her heart." But even through the haze of fading consciousness, I saw it. Rachel's phone screen was dark, completely dark. She wasn't on a call. She was speaking into nothing, performing panic, while I lay dying at her feet. I tried to point, tried to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. Attorney Morrison saw it too. I watched his eyes narrow, watched him grab his own phone with sharp, decisive movements. "This is David Morrison. I need paramedics immediately at 4521 Oak Street, Suite 300. Possible cardiac emergency. A woman has collapsed. Please hurry." The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Rachel's face. She was looking down at me, and her expression wasn't panicked or frightened or worried. It was patient, calm, almost satisfied, like someone watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. Then there was nothing. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time lost all meaning in that dark space. But at some point I became aware of movement of sirens, of hands, lifting me onto something flat and hard. An ambulance. I was in an ambulance. My phone was still clutched in my hand. The paramedics must have found it in my grip and left it there. Through the fog, I saw the screen light up with a notification. Dana's name. Her response to my text. I forced my eyes to focus, forced the words to make sense through the haze of whatever was happening to my body. "Melissa, those aren't your pills. That's B12. Where's your real medication?" "This is serious. Call me now." B12. Vitamins. I'd been taking vitamins for 3 days while my heart slowly failed. I tried to show, the paramedic tried to make my mouth form words, but nothing worked. My body had betrayed me completely. I could only lie there clutching my phone, watching the ceiling of the ambulance blur above me. Rachel knew. She had watched me take those fake pills every morning and every evening. She had asked about my medication schedule. She had switched my blood thinners for vitamins that did nothing. My sister had tried to kill me. And as the darkness pulled me under again, I thought of her standing over me, pretending to call for help while my heart struggled to beat. She wanted me to die, and I almost did. I woke to the sound of beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. The hospital room was dim, the blinds drawn, against what looked like evening light. My chest ached with a dull, persistent pain, and my throat felt like sandpaper. But I was alive. Somehow, against whatever odds Rachel had calculated, I was still alive. A nurse noticed my eyes open and hurried out. Minutes later, a doctor entered, followed by a detective in a dark blazer, and then my family. My parents looked shell-shocked, their faces pale and drawn. Rachel stood slightly behind them, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern. Attorney Morrison came in last, carrying his briefcase and a laptop. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, introduced herself as Dr. Reeves. She addressed the room, but her words were clearly meant for everyone to hear. Ms. Gray experienced a dangerous cardiac event caused by sudden withdrawal from her beta blockers. She said, her voice calm but serious. She hadn't had any effective medication in her system for approximately 72 hours. Her heart went into severe tachycardia, and we found early signs of cardiac ischemia. That means her heart muscle was being damaged from lack of oxygen. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. If she'd arrived at the hospital 30 minutes later, we'd likely be discussing permanent heart damage. Or worse. She held up a pill bottle that I recognized as mine. These are vitamin B12 supplements. Not metoprolol, not blood thinners, just vitamins. The room went completely silent. Rachel recovered first. She always did. "That's impossible," she said, her voice pitched with just the right amount of disbelief. "Melissa must have mixed up her prescriptions. She's been so scattered lately with Grandpa's death. You know how she is always confused about things." I watched her perform concern, watched her try to spin the narrative one more time. But this time I had something I'd never had before. I had proof. I didn't mix anything up. My voice came out hoarse, rough from the tubes they'd put down my throat, but it was steady. I reached for my phone on the bedside table and held it up the screen, displaying my text conversation with Dana. I noticed something felt wrong on my first day at Mom and Dad's house. I thought it was grief. But by yesterday, my symptoms were getting worse, not better. This morning before the will reading, I photographed my pills and sent them to my friend Dana. She's an ER nurse at Memorial Hospital. I scrolled to show the timestamps the photo of the pills, Dana's alarmed response. She confirmed they weren't my prescription. She told me to call her immediately. I have the original text with timestamps. I documented the discrepancy before I collapsed. I looked directly at the detective, a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook in her hand. I didn't know who was responsible, but I knew something was wrong. The room stayed silent. My mother looked confused, her mouth slightly open, like she couldn't process what she was hearing. My father's face had gone gray, and for once he wasn't looking at Rachel like she held all the answers. For the first time in 35 years, I commanded the room. No one dismissed me. No one told me I was being dramatic. No one changed the subject to something Rachel had accomplished. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat. "Given these circumstances," he said, opening his briefcase, "I'm required to open Mr. Gray's sealed instructions." He pulled out an envelope I hadn't seen before, separate from the main will documents. It was marked in Grandpa's handwriting, to be opened only if conflict or crisis occurs at the reading. Morrison broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. He began to read aloud, his voice measured and clear. "To whoever reads this, I have watched my family for many years. I've seen things that troubled me, patterns I couldn't prove but couldn't ignore. 6 months before my death, I hired a licensed private investigator to document certain concerns about financial irregularities and family dynamics. I prayed I was being paranoid. If this letter is being opened, I wasn't." He paused, glancing at the detective before continuing. "David, please share the investigator's preliminary findings with whatever authorities are present. The full report is in your office safe. To Melissa, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive. I made sure the truth would be undeniable when I was gone. You were always the one who deserved better. William Gray." Tears blurred my vision. Grandpa had seen it. He had seen all of it, the favoritism, the dismissal, the way I was treated as less than. And he had tried in his final months to do something about it. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. For once she had no quick response, no smooth explanation ready. My mother whispered, "What is he talking about? What financial irregularities?" Attorney Morrison didn't answer directly. Instead, he connected his laptop to the television mounted on the hospital room wall. "Our waiting room has standard security cameras," he explained. "Given Mr. Gray's instructions, I reviewed this week's footage before coming here." The screen flickered to life, showing the waiting room of Morrison's law office. The timestamp read 3 days ago. Rachel entered the frame early before anyone else had arrived. She looked around carefully, then reached into her purse. But Morrison shook his head. "The switch didn't happen at my office. Rachel was careful there." He clicked to a different video file. "This is from your parents' house. 3 days ago. I obtained it this afternoon from their doorbell camera system." The footage showed the upstairs hallway of my parents' home. Rachel walked into frame, glancing over her shoulder. She opened my toiletry bag, the one I'd left in the bathroom, and pulled out my pill bottle. Then she pulled an identical bottle from her pocket. She made the swap quickly, her movements practiced and deliberate. She looked around one more time, then walked away, tucking my real medication into her purse. I watched my sister's face as the video played. I watched it transform from careful composure to shock, then fear, then something harder, the look of an animal that had been cornered and knew it. "Rachel," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. "Would you like to explain?" Before she could respond, the detective's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression sharpened. She looked up at Attorney Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, your office just forwarded the investigator's preliminary summary. There are some concerning financial flags connected to Mr. Gray's accounts in the 18 months before his death. We'll need to verify with the banks." She turned to Rachel. "Ms. Gray, I need you to come to the station. We have some questions that go beyond the medication issue." Rachel's composure finally shattered. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising. "You're all being manipulated. Grandpa was confused at the end. He didn't know what he was saying or doing. He was an old man with a grudge against me because I wouldn't let him control everything. Rachel. My father's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through her protest like a knife. Stop talking. I looked at my father. In 35 years, I had never once heard him tell Rachel to stop. I had never seen him look at her with anything but adoration. Now he looked at her like he didn't recognize her. Rachel stood frozen, her mouth open, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally. But our mother wouldn't meet her gaze. Our father had turned away. Attorney Morrison was packing up his laptop with quiet efficiency. The detective waited by the door, patient and implacable. For the first time in her life, Rachel had no one defending her. And watching her realize that watching the understanding dawn on her face, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet, exhausted clarity. The truth was finally undeniable, and Rachel would have to face it alone. 5 days passed before I was strong enough to face what came next. The hospital discharged me with a new prescription, a heart monitor to wear for the next month, and strict instructions to avoid stress. That last part seemed almost laughable given what I was walking into. Attorney Morrison had called a formal family meeting at his office. The police investigation had progressed faster than anyone expected. Bank records had been subpoenaed. The private investigator's full report had been compiled and verified. Rachel had been questioned multiple times, and she'd finally hired a lawyer of her own. I walked into Morrison's conference room to find everyone already seated. My parents sat on one side of the table, looking like they'd aged 10 years in less than a week. Rachel sat beside a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was her attorney. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Morrison wasted no time. He opened a thick folder and began laying documents across the table like cards in a game that had already been decided. 18 months ago, he said, his voice measured and precise. When Mr. Gray's Parkinson's made his handwriting increasingly shaky, someone began forging his signature on loan documents. 3 separate loans were taken against his home equity, totaling $157,000. He slid bank records across the polished wood. I recognized the format immediately from my work. Account numbers, transaction dates, amounts. A paper trail that told a story of systematic theft. The funds were transferred to accounts in Rachel's name, Morrison continued. From there, the money went to online gambling platforms, approximately $89,000. Cryptocurrency investments that subsequently collapsed, $52,000. The remaining $16,000 went to credit card payments and personal expenses. I did the math instantly. It was what I did for a living after all. The loans are coming due, I said, looking at Rachel. That's why you needed Grandpa's inheritance so desperately. You were about to default. Rachel said nothing. Her lawyer had clearly advised her to stay silent, and for once she was listening to someone else's advice. Morrison nodded. Rachel was weeks away from default when Mr. Gray passed. If Melissa had inherited her share of the estate, or worse, if she'd been given control as the trust's executor, the fraud would have been discovered during the standard estate audit. He looked directly at Rachel. You didn't just want the inheritance. You needed Melissa incapacitated or gone, so no one would look closely at the books. Rachel's attorney cleared his throat. My client maintains that Mr. Gray authorized these loans. His Parkinson's affected his memory. He may have signed the documents and simply forgotten. Morrison's expression didn't change, but his voice went flat. The investigator addressed that theory. Mr. Gray underwent cognitive testing 4 months before his death. He was mentally sharp. His doctors documented it thoroughly. He paused. He also told me directly 3 months before he passed, and I quote, "Something is wrong with Rachel's visits. I can't prove it, but I feel it." That's when he hired the investigator and added the sealed instructions to his will. My mother broke down sobbing. The sound filled the room, raw and desperate. "Rachel, please," she begged. "Tell us this isn't true. Tell us there's an explanation. There has to be an explanation." Rachel was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Everyone expected me to be perfect, to succeed, to have the life you all wanted me to have." She looked at our parents with something between anger and pleading. "Do you know what it's like to be the one everyone watches? Every achievement had to be bigger than the last. Every failure would have been unforgivable. When I got into trouble, I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't fail. I just needed time. I just needed to fix it before anyone found out." I listened to her excuses, and something cold settled in my chest. "So you stole from a dying man," I said, my voice even. "And when that wasn't enough, you tried to kill your sister." Rachel's head snapped toward me. "I didn't try to kill you." "You replaced my heart medication with vitamins for 3 days. You watched me deteriorate. You commented on how pale I looked while knowing exactly why. You pretended to call 911 while I was dying on the floor." I held her gaze without flinching. "What would you call it?" She had no answer. For once in her life, Rachel had no clever response, no charming deflection, no way to spin the truth into something more comfortable. I turned to my parents. My father sat motionless, staring at the bank records like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. My mother was still crying, her face buried in her hands. "For 35 years, I said, and my voice was calm despite everything roiling inside me. "I told you something was wrong. Not about fraud. About how this family worked. Every time Rachel hurt me, you found reasons to excuse her. Every time I succeeded, you minimized it. Every time I asked for help, you told me I was being dramatic or jealous or oversensitive." I looked at my father. "You taught her that being charming was more important than being honest. You rewarded her smiles and ignored her lies." I looked at my mother. "You taught her that she never had to face consequences because you'd always smooth things over. You made excuses for her until making excuses became her entire personality." "We didn't know," my mother whispered. "We never imagined she would—" "You didn't want to know." My voice was tired now, not angry. Anger takes energy I no longer had. "That's worse. You chose comfort over truth for 35 years. You chose the easy daughter over the honest one, and this is where it led." I stood and faced Rachel directly. There was something I needed her to hear, and I needed to say it while I still had the clarity. 18 months ago, when you first got into trouble, if you'd come to me and told me the truth, I would have helped you. I'm a financial analyst. I solve problems like debt restructuring professionally. I could have negotiated with your creditors. I could have helped you find treatment for the gambling. We could have figured something out together. My voice hardened. "But you didn't see me as someone who could help. You saw me as competition, as an obstacle, as someone whose life was worth less than your debt. You looked at your sister and decided I was expendable." I picked up my purse. "You're going to face legal consequences. I won't ask the court to be harsh. I won't ask them to be lenient. I'll tell the truth, provide my evidence, and let the system work. That's more fairness than you gave me." I paused at the door and looked back at her one final time. "But you and I are finished. Not because I hate you, because I finally understand. You were never capable of being my sister. You only knew how to be a competitor, and I'm done competing for a family that was never fair to begin with." Attorney Morrison cleared his throat. "One final matter, per Mr. Gray's trust provisions, any beneficiary convicted of a crime against the family or estate automatically forfeits all inheritance rights." He looked at Rachel's lawyer. "Given the pending charges and the documented evidence, I recommend your client prepare for that outcome." Rachel's composure shattered completely. She turned to me, with desperation written across her face. "You can stop this. Refuse to testify. Tell them you don't want to press charges. We're family, Melissa. We're blood." I looked at her, this stranger who shared my parents, and felt nothing but a quiet, settled certainty. "We share DNA," I said. "That's not the same thing. Family protects each other. You chose to harm me. Actions have consequences, Rachel. That's something our parents should have taught you 30 years ago." I walked out without looking back. 3 months after I walked out of that conference room, Rachel stood before a judge and pleaded guilty. Her attorney had negotiated a deal. The alternative was federal prosecution for bank fraud, which carried mandatory minimums of 10 to 20 years in prison. By pleading guilty to state charges instead, Rachel avoided the worst outcome. But the consequences were still severe, and I watched from the gallery as the judge read them aloud. Forgery, a Class D felony, 3 years suspended sentence. Bank fraud at the state level, 2 years suspended. Reckless endangerment in the first degree, 18 months suspended. The total came to 6.5 years, all suspended, with 5 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service every year, mandatory enrollment in an addiction treatment program for her gambling. and a felony record that would follow her for the rest of her life, affecting her ability to find work, rent an apartment, even vote in some states. The financial consequences were equally devastating. Full restitution of $157,000 plus $23,000 in interest, all payable to Grandpa's estate. Complete forfeiture of any inheritance rights under the trust's morality clause. Her lawyer had already told her that personal bankruptcy was inevitable within 6 months. The restraining order was the final piece. 5 years renewable at my request. No contact by any means. If she violated it, she would go to prison immediately. The local news had covered the case extensively. I'd seen the headlines. Golden child to felon, local woman. Pleads guilty to defrauding dying grandfather. Rachel's carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. The country club friends the charity committee positions the perfect life social media following. She'd cultivated for years. All of it evaporated overnight. The image she'd spent 32 years building was gone. Before the judge finalized the sentence, he turned to me. Ms. Gray, do you wish to make a victim impact statement? I stood. Yes, Your Honor. I faced forward toward the bench, deliberately not looking at Rachel. 3 months ago, my sister replaced my heart medication with vitamins. She watched me get sicker for 3 days. When I collapsed, she pretended to call for help while I was dying on the floor of a lawyer's office. My voice was steady. I'd practiced this not because I needed to convince anyone, but because I needed to say it clearly without emotion clouding the facts. She did this to cover up fraud, $157,000 stolen from our grandfather while he was weakened by Parkinson's disease. She forged his signature on loan documents. She exploited his trust and his illness for gambling money and failed investments. I paused, letting the words settle. I'm not here to ask for maximum punishment. I'm also not here to ask for leniency. I'm here to state facts and let this court do its job. Rachel made choices over 18 months. Deliberate, calculated choices. She chose to steal. She chose to lie. She chose to endanger my life rather than face the consequences of her own actions. I took a breath. The legal system exists to weigh those choices. I trust it to do so fairly. My role is to tell the truth. The court's role is to deliver justice. Those are separate responsibilities. I sat down. I never once looked at Rachel, and I never would again. After the sentencing, my parents found me in the courthouse hallway. My mother was crying, her face swollen and red. My father looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 months. They approached hesitantly, like they weren't sure I would let them speak. Melissa, please, my mother said. Can we talk? Can we try to fix this? I looked at them for a long moment. These people who had raised me, dismissed me, and enabled the sister who had nearly killed me. Part of me wanted to walk away without a word, but a larger part of me knew that completely cutting them off would only leave wounds that festered. We can talk, I said finally. But here are my conditions. Phone calls twice a month, 30 minutes maximum. If you mention Rachel, the call ends immediately. No visits for 1 year. After that, we'll reassess based on how things go. No financial involvement of any kind. No opinions about my inheritance decisions. No requests for money ever. And no pressure to forgive and forget. No pushing me to reconcile with Rachel. Not now, not ever. My mother sobbed harder. My father nodded slowly, his eyes wet. If you can respect those boundaries consistently for 12 months, I continued, we can discuss what comes next. If you can't, then this conversation is the end of our relationship. We understand, my father said quietly. We have a lot to make up for. Yes, I agreed. You do. And making up for it will take years, not conversations. Show me through actions. That's all I'll accept. I walked away with a clarity I'd never felt before. The inheritance after legal fees and Rachel's forfeited share totaled $2.1 million. I was careful with it. $400,000 went to establish the William Gray Community Center for seniors housed in the Victorian home where my grandfather had spent his final years. $200,000 went to the cardiac unit that had saved my life. $150,000 funded a scholarship for first-generation college students in Grandpa's name. The rest I invested conservatively enough to feel secure without excess. I kept enough to feel safe. not rich, free. While cleaning out Grandpa's study, I found a locked drawer I'd never noticed before. Inside was a box of letters spanning 20 years. Some had been mailed to me over the years, and I remembered receiving them, but most had never been sent. The final letter was dated 1 week before his death. "My dear Melissa," it began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll know everything. I'm sorry the truth had to come out this way. I watched our family fail you for 35 years. I saw your parents choose Rachel's comfort over your well-being again and again. I saw you grow strong anyway, not because of your family, but despite them. I couldn't change how they treated you. I was too old, too sick, and truthfully too much of a coward to start the war that confronting them would have caused. That's my failing, and I'll carry it wherever I'm going. But I could do one thing. I could make sure that when I was gone, no one could bury the truth. I could make sure you'd finally be believed. The inheritance isn't the point, Melissa. Money is just money. What I wanted to give you was proof. Proof that you weren't crazy, that you weren't dramatic, that the things you felt were real. You were always the one who saw clearly. You were always the one who deserved more than you received. Live free now." Not free from family, but free from the need for their approval. You never needed to prove your worth to them. Your worth was never in question, only their ability to see it. I see you, Melissa. I've always seen you, with all my love. Grandpa. I sat in his study surrounded by his books and photographs, and I cried, not from grief or anger, but from the release of 35 years of doubt. 1 year later, I stood at the entrance of the William Gray Community Center as it opened its doors for the first time. The old Victorian had been transformed with bright paint, accessible ramps, and a garden where elderly visitors could sit in the sun. A reporter approached me. "Ms. Gray, some people say you let your sister off easy, that you should have pushed for prison time." I considered the question. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing. Rachel committed crimes and faced legal consequences. She has a felony record, a mountain of debt, and the knowledge that everyone knows exactly who she is now. The court handled her punishment. I'm handling my life. Those are separate things. An elderly woman approached the entrance looking uncertain. I smiled and extended my hand. "Welcome. I'm Melissa. Would you like to come in?" Her face relaxed. I wasn't sure if I belonged here. "Everyone belongs here," I said. "That's the whole point." I led her inside, not as a victim who survived, but as a woman who finally knew her own worth. Melissa's story reminds us of something important. Blood relation does not automatically mean family. True family protects and sees you for who you really are. When someone repeatedly harms you or treats you as invisible, you have every right to walk away. The most powerful lesson here is this: your worth is not determined by how others treat you. Melissa spent 35 years believing she was the problem, but she was never the problem. She was simply surrounded by people who refused to see her value. Many of us have experienced something similar, being overlooked or dismissed, when we simply asked for basic respect. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. Melissa did not seek revenge. She simply told the truth and allowed consequences to unfold naturally. That is true strength. Also remember to trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, pay attention. Melissa documented the discrepancy with her medication before she even understood what was happening. That single decision saved her life. Finally, it is never too late to reclaim your story. Whether you are 35 or 75, you deserve to be seen and valued. Thank you for listening today. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel so you do not miss future stories. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family? Share your experience. Your story matters, and someone out there might need to hear it today.